The dim light of late afternoon filled the small room where John sat at his old wooden desk. In front of him were the scattered pages of an old book and some yellowed newspaper clippings. His eyes were fixed on the headline he was reading for the 100th time: Secrets of an Abandoned Mental Hospital, Urban Legends and Scary Secrets. John had worked as a journalist for over a decade and was used to various sensationalized stories, but this one was special. The legend of the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city, where it was rumored that once practiced a doctor who made cruel experiments on his patients, fascinated him from the first moment. It was rumored that the ghost of this doctor still roamed the gloomy corridors, frightening those who dared to enter the abandoned building. John first heard the story from his childhood friend Tom, who told him about his experience visiting the hospital one night. Tom described the strange sounds, the cold wind chilling to the bone, and the fleeting shadows flickering in the darkness. But it was Tom's words about what he saw that impressed him most: a figure in a white coat with empty eyes watching him from a dark corner. John had encountered many urban legends over the years, but this one caught his particular attention. He decided it was time to find out the truth. Thus began his obsession with the place. He spent weeks gathering information, studying old archives, talking to locals who were reluctant to share their memories. Some said they had seen lights in the windows of the abandoned building at night. Others claimed to have heard screams and moans coming from inside. John prepared thoroughly for his expedition. He had packed everything he needed: a flashlight, a camera, a recorder, and some protective amulets that an old fortune teller at the market had advised him. "I don't know if you believe it or not," she said as she handed him an amulet, "but in places like this, any help wouldn't hurt." The day came when John set out on his journey. The evening sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, coloring the sky with red-orange hues. He drove down the old road leading to the hospital, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. The fog rising from the ground surrounded his car, creating an ominous atmosphere. The outline of a building appeared in the distance, gloomy, abandoned, as if frozen in time. When he got closer, John stopped the car and got out. The old mental hospital loomed before him, a building that seemed to radiate coldness and darkness all by itself. He inhaled deeply, smelling the damp and musty odor mixed with something elusive, almost like the smell of fear. "Well, let's get started," he said quietly to himself, turning on his flashlight and heading towards the massive iron doors leading inside. At this point, John did not yet know what lay ahead, but he was determined to find out the truth and tell the world what lurked in the shadows of this gloomy hospital's past. John had been carefully preparing for his expedition. In recent days, he had spent more and more time researching the site map and building plans found in the city archives. He also tried to gather as much information as possible from the local residents, many of whom were reluctant to share their memories of the ominous hospital. Early in the morning, the day before his planned trip, John went to the market to meet the old fortune teller who had given him the amulet. She turned out to be the only person who willingly talked about the abandoned hospital and its horrors. The woman was sitting behind her counter, stacked with many antiques, when John approached her. "You're back," she said without raising her eyes from her work. "Yes," John replied. "I'm going to the hospital tomorrow." She nodded as if she'd expected that. "Be careful, though. This place is a soul trap. It feeds on fear." The next morning, John got up early and gathered all the equipment and provisions he needed. He knew the day would be long and full of the unknown. In his backpack, he had a flashlight, camera, recorder, spare batteries, a fortune teller's amulet, and some food and water. The path to the hospital was not an easy one. The road leading there was long overgrown and abandoned. John drove down the narrow dirt road, feeling his car shake on every bump. Soon all that was left around him was dense forest and fog rising from the ground, creating a ghostly atmosphere. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, John felt a growing unease. The fog grew thicker and thicker, and it seemed to surround the car on all sides, obscuring everything around it. A vague outline of a building loomed up ahead that John recognized immediately. It was the very hospital he had read and heard so much about. He stopped the car in a small vacant lot in front of the building and got out. The old, gloomy structure loomed before him, looking even more ominous in the light of the passing day. The walls were covered in mold, the windows were broken out, and the roof was partially collapsed. John felt a strange chill penetrating to his bones, even though the evening had been warm. Gathering all his equipment, John headed for the massive iron doors leading inside. They creaked when he pushed them open, as if they hadn't been opened in a long time. It was dark and quiet inside, with the occasional sound of dripping water coming from deep inside the building. John turned on his flashlight and took the first step inside. The old, dusty corridors stretched out before him like endless mazes, and each step echoed with a resounding thud. He could feel the tension building, and every nerve in him was taut as a string. As he walked through the corridors, John scrutinized every detail. He saw old medical instruments strewn across the floor and long-forgotten patient charts lying on tables. It was clear that this place had once been the site of brutal experiments that legends told of. In one of the corridors, John found a door leading to the basement. On the map he had studied, this was where the doctor's laboratory had been located. He sighed, gathering all his courage, and started down the creaky wooden steps leading to the dark basement. It was here, in the heart of the abandoned hospital, that he hoped to find the answers to his questions. John walked slowly down the old wooden steps leading to the basement. Each step echoed as if the building itself was listening intently to his movements. It was almost completely dark below, with only the dim light of a lantern picking out bits of space from the gloom. There was a musty smell in the air, mixed with the faint scent of mold and chemicals. The basement was much larger than John had expected. The walls, shabby and covered in cobwebs, went into the darkness, creating a sense of infinity. He began to look around the room, finding old medical instruments, broken glass flasks, and rusted metal tables. John shuddered as the flashlight illuminated another fine iron straps attached to a table that were clearly used to secure patients. Suddenly there was a sound in the silence, a slight rustle, as if something or someone was moving across the floor. John froze, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. Probably a rat, he muttered to himself, trying to calm down. His heart continued to pound frantically, however. Moving on, John came across an old closet where he found the patient's medical records. He pulled one out and began to read. The gruesome descriptions of experiments conducted by the legendary doctor confirmed his worst fears. Patient 23 administration of an unknown drug that caused severe hallucinations and uncontrollable aggression. Patient died 3 days later. The further John read, the stronger his feeling that someone was watching him became. He could feel the cold sweat running down his back. Suddenly he heard heavy footsteps, as if someone had stepped onto the wooden steps he himself had walked down a few minutes ago. John turned around sharply, pointing his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but saw no one. "Who's here?" his voice echoed in the empty basement. There was no response, but the feeling of presence didn't go away. John sighed and decided to continue his inspection, though his hands shook with exertion. In one corner of the basement he found a door leading to a small room. It was closed, but not locked. John slowly opened it and stepped inside. There, on an old wooden table, was a diary covered in dust. John opened it and began to read. It was the notes of a doctor who, as it turned out, had actually conducted cruel experiments. Day 45. Today's patient didn't make it through the dosage. I have to find a way to reduce the side effects so the results will be more stable. Their screaming is starting to annoy me. Maybe I need to increase the sedative dosage. Suddenly, John heard a sound that made his heart quicken, a quiet but distinct whisper coming from behind him. He turned around sharply, but saw no one. The whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. He heard words that he couldn't make out, as if someone were trying to communicate with him in an incomprehensible language. When he finally made it to the first floor, the hospital doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening thud. John stood there, breathing heavily, trying to comprehend what had happened. He had managed to escape, but he knew this was only the beginning. The secrets of the abandoned hospital were far scarier than he could have imagined, and now he had no turning back. John stood, breathing heavily, on the first floor of the abandoned hospital. His heart was beating so loudly that it seemed as if its sound echoed throughout the building. The basement doors he had just struggled with were now tightly closed. He raised the flashlight, and the dim light picked out the peeling walls and debris on the floor from the darkness. A sudden cold wind blew through the hallway, and John felt goosebumps run down his spine. He gathered his thoughts and decided to continue exploring. He still had questions to answer and material he wanted to capture on camera. John moved cautiously through the corridors, trying not to make any noise. Every now and then he stopped to capture something unusual on camera: old medical instruments, broken windows, chairs covered in dust and cobwebs. The words of the old fortune teller kept echoing in his head. This place is a soul trap. It feeds on fear. As John walked past one of the rooms, he noticed strange footprints on the floor leading inside. He decided to check the place out. As he entered the room, he saw papers scattered on the floor and an old metal cabinet that looked like it had recently been opened. John began to scrutinize the papers, finding patient reports and doctor's notes among them. Suddenly, the room became noticeably colder. John felt the air around him become denser and his breathing became visible in the frosty air. He realized that the temperature had dropped below normal. Before he could consider what this could mean, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around sharply and saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. A figure in a white robe stood at the end of the hallway, swaying slightly back and forth. The ghost's face was distorted with hatred and pain, and its eyes were empty, lifeless, like bottomless black holes. The doctor's ghost was staring straight at John, as if piercing him through. John froze in place, unable to move. The ghost slowly began to move toward him, its footsteps silent, but each one echoed in John's heart with a resounding thump. John knew he should run, but his body felt paralyzed with terror. Finally, gathering all his courage, John turned and rushed away, flying past corridors and rooms. Behind him, he heard a low, ominous whisper that seemed to be following him. He ran without stopping until he was in the central hall where patients were once admitted. Suddenly, the light of his flashlight began to flicker, and he felt an icy breath on his neck. He turned again and saw that the ghost stood only a few feet away from him. The doctor raised his hand and John felt an invisible force pulling him back, as if the air itself had become a dense mass holding him in place. "You shouldn't have come here," the ghost said in a hoarse but distinct voice. "This place is not for the living." John tried to free himself, but his strength was waning. He could feel the darkness surrounding him, and the cold was becoming unbearable. Suddenly, his hand came across the amulet the old fortune teller had given him. John squeezed it in his hand and felt the warmth begin to spread through his body. The ghost let out a shrill cry and retreated as if burned by an invisible force. John, feeling liberated, rushed for the exit. He ran out into the street, panting with excitement and exhaustion, but in that moment he knew one thing: he was saved. Looking around, John saw that night had fallen, and the fog had enveloped everything around him, creating an ominous atmosphere. He sat down on the ground, trying to come to his senses and make sense of what had happened. The ghost was real, and its presence in the hospital confirmed all the legends. But John also realized that this place still held many secrets, and despite his fear, he must continue his exploration. John sat on the ground at the entrance to the abandoned mental hospital, trying to regain his breath and calm down. The night air was cold and damp, the fog shrouding everything around him, hiding the hospital in its dense veil. His mind still echoed the whispers and screams he had heard inside. He knew he had to leave this place, but he also realized that it was impossible to leave without finishing what he had started. John slowly stood up, gathered his thoughts, and decided to return to the hospital. He had to find out why the doctor's ghost was still here and what exactly had happened within these walls years ago. Gathering his wits, John entered the building again. He scrutinized every corner, listening carefully for any sounds. He moved slowly this time, trying not to attract attention. He knew the ghost could still be around somewhere. As he approached one of the old offices, John noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Inside, he found an old desk littered with papers. Among them was a tattered notebook that seemed to belong to the very same doctor. He began to read the entries, and with each new page the picture became clearer. Day 78. Experiments continue, but the results are unpredictable. The patients are suffering, their condition is getting worse, but I can't stop. I must find a cure, even if I have to sacrifice everything. Day 112. They come for me in my dreams. Their faces are contorted with pain, their eyes full of suffering. I can't sleep, but I must go on. I'm close to figuring it out. John felt his heart clench with terror. The doctor was obsessed with his goal and didn't notice how he was turning into a monster. His experiments had caused many people to suffer and die, and their souls probably remained here, bound to the place of their torment. Suddenly, he heard a slight rustle, as if someone was moving around the room. John picked up the flashlight and illuminated the space in front of him. In the corner stood the figure of a doctor, his eyes burning with anger and pain. The ghost began to move toward him, and John felt the coldness engulf him again. "You must leave," the ghost said, his voice sounding like an echo from the depths of darkness. "This place is not for the living." John knew what he had to do. He pulled out the amulet the old fortune teller had given him and pointed it in the ghost's direction. "You will no longer torment these souls. You must leave, and they must find peace." The ghost stopped, its eyes widened, and it let out a piercing scream. At that moment, the amulet shone with a bright light, and the shadows surrounding the doctor began to fade. The ghost tried to resist, but its power was waning, and soon it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a slight whisper. John stood in silence, feeling a peace descend upon him. He knew that the doctor's ghost would not return again, and the souls that had suffered here had finally found freedom. He gathered his things and headed for the exit. As John stepped outside, he felt the fog begin to clear and the moonlight illuminated the abandoned building. It seemed less ominous now, as if the shadows of the past had finally left the place. John got into the car and started the engine. He realized that his journey was not over. The story of the abandoned mental hospital and its horrors would be told, and the world would learn the truth about those who had suffered and died here. But most importantly, he was able to do what many had failed to do: free the souls trapped in this dark place. The next day, when John returned home, he began writing his article. Every word, every sentence was imbued with the fear and courage he had experienced. This story was important not only to him, but to all those who had once lived and died within the walls of that hospital. He knew that their story had to be told so that their memory would live on forever. Closing his laptop, John looked out the window. He felt that he had done something important, that his efforts had not been in vain. Although he had new adventures ahead of him, this story would stay with him forever, as a reminder that even in the darkest places, light could be found if you weren't afraid to look for it. John began to back away slowly toward the exit of the room, his heart pounding and his mind beating with anxiety. At that moment, the lantern light suddenly began to flicker, and he felt an icy breath on his neck. Turning, he met the blank, dead eyes of a figure in a white coat. The doctor stood directly in front of him, his face contorted with hatred and pain. With a scream of terror, John rushed to escape, feeling the darkness and cold surrounding him. The ghost pursued him, its footsteps resounding in the empty basement. John ran out of the room, dropping all his belongings and rushing towards the exit. Each step echoed in his head like a hammer blow, but he managed to get to the stairs and started climbing.